Stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down. The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions, and the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long, grueling war, though.
So I mentioned this at the end of my last video, but because of trench warfare, this war could not be won through conventional means. This means that the governments in World War I, they would have to demoralize the civilian populations. So basically, popular support would go against the war, and they will sue for peace. So that was the goal, just to get one of these countries just to sue for peace, and then the war could theoretically end. So some tactics for this that they used were blockades, bombings. They would attack civilian populations, or they would just simply let the casualty numbers continuously go up, and it'll be published in the newspapers. People would read this every day, knowing that their friends, their loved ones were dying, and it would just make people wonder if this war was just simply worth it or not.
So they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number one, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea. The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans. Some new combatants...
So the war in Africa is actually very interesting because some of the roots of things like the Rwandan Genocide can actually trace its roots back to World War I, when the Allies were taking what was former German territories. Rwanda was actually used to be a German territory. However, during World War I, it was taken over by the Belgians, and the Belgians started pinning the Hutsus and the Tutsis against each other, and obviously that led to a genocide. But because of World War I, most of all the Germany's territory in Africa was basically dispersed out, and this created ethnic tensions throughout many of these nations in years to come. So very interesting how just this simple African frontier led to basically all these just crazy civil wars, all these crazy ethnic conflicts in Africa.
The war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance.
So Japan is kind of one of the forgotten members of the Allies during World War I. And this sort of disrespect led to the anger and aggression of Imperial Japan that we see in World War II. In a nutshell, Japan wanted more territory than the Allies were willing to give them, especially in China, but they received Germany's Pacific Islands, such as the Marshall Islands. But what's crazy to me is basically the same thing happened to Italy after the war. They were promised more land than they actually received, and it's fascinating how both of these countries were angered. They turned to fascism, and they essentially became strong allies of the Axis powers. So World War I, again, leading into new conflicts. That war to end all wars certainly was not that.
Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides. Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war.
Yeah, Italy really didn't do that much, and that's honestly why they didn't receive the crazy stuff that they wanted. But also realistically, they couldn't carve out if you look to the right of Italy, they essentially wanted that whole coastline, and that's just not possible. I forget what the region's called. Forgive me for that, but it was so much territory they wanted. It would almost double the size of their country, but there was just unrealistic expectations for Italy to acquire any of that.
Power's new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottoman were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back.
Okay, so let me describe the Black Sea raid a little bit. Essentially, the Ottoman war minister has been going behind the government's back with the German ambassador to try to get the Ottoman Empire into the war. Initially, they attempted to do this within the conventional political system, but the government was still divided, as you can see by Oversimplified's graphic here. So they did what any good politician does. They stole the fleet and they started bombing the Russian fleet. Then they went back to their government and was like, whoops, we're at war now. But the crazy thing about the Black Sea raid is that it actually worked. They got the Ottoman Empire into the war despite their government being a little hesitant. This is obviously a huge mistake for the Ottoman Empire because they lost so much territory after the war, and a war they probably could have stayed out of.
Said, whoops, looks like we're at war now. The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to...
Is it just me, but why do military leaders have such a hard time preparing for war with Russia? Just think about it. The Ottomans, Hitler, Napoleon, all failed because they didn't properly equip their soldiers for the Russian winter. Whenever you think of Russia, you think of cold. It seems simplistic to me, and if some United States military leader happens to watch this video and we go to war with Russia, just remember to properly fit our soldiers with winter gear if we invade it. Come on, guys. This is basic stuff. It's hilarious to me that this keeps happening throughout history.
Then they crossed miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed. The Ottomans blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory, and the resulting Armenian Genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people. Then
the Armenian Genocide is technically the first genocide in human history. Though there were genocides prior to this, they were not, according to academia, they were not genocides because the term wasn't coined until after the Armenian Genocide. So what is really unfortunate is that the Armenian Genocide is really the forgotten genocide. Many world governments to basically have Turkey as an ally, including the United States, failed to acknowledge it. And the reason why Turkey doesn't acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, and frankly gets very offended when you claim that they committed the Armenian Genocide, is because it was done under the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't done by Turkey, but it's basically the same government, so that's a really disgusting thing. And this hesitancy to talk about the Armenian Genocide is actually why Hitler believed he could get away with what he did in the Holocaust, because of how forgotten the Armenian Genocide is. I don't want to go deep into it, but hundreds of thousands of Armenians just marched to their death in the Syrian desert. It's just absolutely despicable acts, and it needs to be talked about more. And this is probably not the best way to talk about it, but if you want to see a video where I go like 40 minutes in depth into it, it's insane. But yeah, we need to acknowledge the Armenian Genocide, and it is despicable that we don't.
Sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against the British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan. All these new frontiers hadn't done much to change the war. Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a big conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used
chemical weapons starting to pop up. But like I said, Germany could not realistically fight a war on two fronts. They needed some ways to break the stalemate, and the only way for them to do that is to demoralize the civilian population through air raids, starvings, chemical warfare. Obviously, I'm not advocating for it, but if you look within a historical context, you kind of understand their thought process, because they needed a way to end this war. This war was just fought on two fronts, and this is really the only way they thought they could win.
Marines to sink civilian ships. One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying U.S. opinion.
The Lusitania was not only a, quote, civilian ship, But it had supplies on it. It was, now that we look at it, they definitely had um military supplies on it, and they were transporting it on a civilian ship. So technically, that was allowed, that the Germans could shoot it down. And German unrestricted submarine warfare was a huge reason why the United States entered the war, but it also helped demoralize the populations of other countries. But yeah, it's a huge misconception that the Lusitania was just some random cruise ship. It certainly had military weapons on it and supplies, and it was justified that the Germans did sink it.
Against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary. So Austria-Hungary entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians.
I love the term friendly invasion, because that reminds me what Germany did to Czechoslovakia in World War II. And in regards to Bulgaria, I know very, very little about Bulgaria's involvement in World War I, which is a shame, because one of my history professors, she's actually writes about Bulgaria. She's like one of the top scholars about Bulgaria. So that's very it's very disappointing. I don't know that much about it, but I certainly do need to do some more research on Bulgaria and their involvement in World War One.
Many of whom escaped by sea. It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list. Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit. Around the same time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called Dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle, so they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't try that again.
Isn't it kind of crazy that you have these just basically almost war-changing weapons that countries just failed to use? The Battle of Jutland, that is definitely one of my favorite naval battles in world history, but certainly imagine if these powers actually had the guts to start using these dreadnoughts. I understand how costly they were, but that could have swung some naval battles during the war. Just my opinion.
Started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day. It was also here that the British first used...
So he did not mention this, but I thought I needed to add this. But he mentioned conscription within the United States, which was, the United Kingdom, which was honestly not a very popular policy, especially in Ireland. The conscription crisis started because of this. And across Ireland, Catholic priests and bishops, Irish nationalists, they all protested sending their boys off to fight in what they thought was Britain's war. And they were deeply angered by this. Keep in mind, Easter Rising was just 2 years prior to the UK's conscription laws. So the Irish felt extremely oppressed by the British, which they considered to be their overlords. So though that it was seen as a patriotic thing in the United Kingdom, you have to acknowledge that there are other places in the United Kingdom where they don't have their autonomy. And in my opinion, according to the documents at the time, I don't think Ireland would have been in World War I if they were not part of the United Kingdom. And the conscription crisis shows this, Easter Rising shows this, and the nationalist parties within Ireland also show this. And he's going to mention tanks, so I should probably talk about that. The impact of tanks during World War I should not go unstated. Now suddenly soldiers could go across no man's land. because tanks could drive over barbed wire, they can cross over trenches, but the tank would evolve within the next 2 years in the war. But 1916, when they were first implemented, it wasn't enough to flip the war, but certainly it did flip some battles just because of the new ways you can use the tank to kind of break the stalemate of trench warfare.
One crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology. The Russians had been getting pushed back further and further into their own territory, but in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war, and then they got pounded.
Yeah.
The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies.
So Greece is very interesting. I think it's actually one of the most interesting cases of a country's entry into World War I. So King Constantine of Greece was actually married to Kaiser Wilhelm's sister. So he was naturally very sympathetic to the Germans and therefore the Central Powers. However, Greece had an alliance with Serbia which would tie them to the Allies. So that's where the Prime Minister and other members of the Greek government want to enter the war. But the king refused to honor this because of his sympathies with the Central Powers and obviously not wanting to go to war against his basically his wife's brother. So it's a little bit of history behind the Greek conflict and kind of shows you, because of the monarchies and because of all the family ties, how that could have such a huge impact on what countries do and where they enter the war.
After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. With Allied help, they began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields, and they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad, but the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence of Arabia is one of the best movies of all time. It might be a little dated, but if people in my audience appreciate a good 1960s classical movie, 100% recommend it.
Lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply lines. By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear winner, and it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating, and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was called
Grigory Rasputin. This is one of my favorite historical figures in world history. The song is amazing. Love what he did. There's an excellent documentary about him on Netflix. But he's also known as the Mad Monk. He was the holy healer from Siberia, who was brought in by the Russian royal family to help their son who had hemophilia. But the big downside about Rasputin is that he would have all these huge scandalous parties with Russian nobility, which would create all these newspaper articles and all these scandals for the Tsar. But Rasputin actually hung around with two Russian princesses nicknamed the Crow Sisters, and they were very into the occult. So there was all of Russian high society thought Rasputin had these magical powers. But Rasputin actually engaged in sexual affairs with these two women. This is a common peasant man who is having sexual affairs with Russian princesses. I think they're technically from Montenegro, but some actually said that he had an affair with the Tsarina of Russia. I don't know if that's true, but a lot of people did, and it just kept hitting Tsar Nicholas's just significance in his ability to rule, just because his own people did not respect him because he thought his wife was being bedded by this random Russian monk, and he was also simultaneously disrespecting the country. Just a very fascinating historical figure, and if you ever have the chance, look up how he died. It's crazy. Kingsman actually kind of makes fun of it, but it's kind of accurate.
The shock, there was an uprising in Petrograd, complete with riots and strikes. The riots turned into a full-scale revolution, and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government, and they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great news for Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war, and was getting...
So during the time when the United States was not engaged in World War I, the United States Army was actually engaged on a different front. So they were in Mexico on an expedition to hunt Pancho Villa. So they kind of had a kind of war with Mexico, but this was what the United States was doing at the time. And I'm mentioning Mexico because something is going to happen later involving Mexico.
Super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw.
In my opinion, the Zimmerman telegram is one of the worst mistakes in world history. So what the Zimmerman telegram essentially did was they asked Mexico to invade the United States in exchange for Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. Unfortunately, the British intelligence obviously intercepted the message and gave it to the United States to join the war. So keep in mind, President Woodrow Wilson ran on an anti-war campaign, and this gave him the justification to go to war. He probably would join eventually, but he needed the justification. The Zimmerman telegram, the Lusitania, this gave him enough public support back home to join the war. And Woodrow Wilson, he is one of the worst presidents in American history. If you want to know a little bit about him, he literally showed a Klan movie in the White House, and he enjoyed it. He also saw himself as, like, God, basically.
Troops began shipping out to Europe. This was terrible news for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived.
So knowing the United States were on their way, the Germans' days were numbered. They needed to find a quick end to the war. So what you're going to see here is the Germans become so much more desperate when to end the war. And you also saw this during World War II when they tried to break through the American lines just to try to have a desperate attempt to end the war. But it's kind of interesting how this happened twice.
It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time further north, then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks. By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable
So the Treaty of Versailles is probably the worst treaty in world history. This treaty single-handedly paved the way for the Nazis to gain power in Germany. And this gave way to the stabbed-in-the-back myth, which claimed that the Jews were the reason why the Germans lost the war. Obviously untrue. Luckily, after World War II, we kind of learned our lesson, and we didn't punish Germany, Japan, and Italy like Germany was punished for the Treaty of Versailles. In fact, projects like the Marshall Plan by the United States helped propped up the losers of the war and helped invest back into Europe to rebuild their economies and not force them to pay reparations, which eventually led to economic collapse. They had hyperinflation. People would bring wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. It was crazy. But we learned from our history, and this was a time that we did learn from our history, thank God. But just look at these casualty numbers, though. This is insane. This is all for a war that probably could have been prevented and was caused by just military alliances. This is just crazy.
And millions dead. The world learned its lesson and never had such an awful war again.
No, they did. Until
for about 20 years.
So that's it, guys. Thank you for watching as always, and remember to like and subscribe if you want to see more oversimplified salmonella content. I'm also about to do a new series where I go into in defense. I'm going to call it In Defense Of. And I'm going to be going through canceled historical figures like Thomas Jefferson, Stonewall Jackson, Columbus, George Washington, Lincoln, all these who have recently been criticized by people. And I want to give them a fair case. So it's going to be called In Defense Of.